I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling, written to be performed aloud and then recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD's story is an ongoing one, but you don't need to start from the beginning if you don't want to. Feel free to jump in right here. And once the story's got its hooks in you, you can always go back and listen to previous episodes, or even buy the prose volumes on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 46. Maul awoke to the sound of leathery wings beating the air. His companions, the sorceress and the monk, were still asleep, passed out upon the stone floor of the cave, rubbed smooth by eons of dripping water and steady winds. Xylan was still unconscious from his ordeal, drained of energy by the hungry flame that had devoured the poison coursing through his veins. And Caleria? She was exhausted from administering it. Once inside the cave, once they thought themselves safe from the ravages of that shattered wasteland, Caleria had gone to work. She summoned up the holy flame, the divine fire, the cathartic blaze that hid within that viscous liquid, the sacred solution held inside the 2 water skins she had carried with her since leaving the tower. Her supplies were limited, extremely limited. But without her intervention, the monk, that poor, sad creature, Xylan, her Xylan, would surely perish. So she went to work. The poison was a potent one, and it moved quickly through the monk's system, already compromised from struggle and the exhaustion that inevitably followed a night in that broken world. It wasn't the troll's infection. It was something else. A venom that the massive lizard held within its long, curving teeth. No, Xylan had been the only one who cared if it lived or died. Though Xylan was the only reason the lizard wasn't taken by the trolls, dragged off by their heavy, crude iron chains, that hateful reptile, that bestial ingrate. It attacked him. Nonetheless, the fire, that blessed blaze, it excelled at devouring the troll's noxious infection, the ignorance that threatened to consume what remained of that dying world. It was also more than capable of seeking out Xylan's infection, blasting it with scalding, ravenous heat. Unlike the infection carried by the trolls, which made its home in the flesh, the lizard's venom had sought out Xylan's veins and now threatened to infect his entire body. To find it all, to root it all out, to leave not a single poisonous trace of that deadly venom, Caleria had to use too much of her reserves, far too much, had to empty an entire wineskin and send it flowing through Xylan's veins. But with no other choices, with no other options, that's exactly what she did, holding back her tears as she watched the skinny monk writhe in agony upon the ground, letting out silent screams of anguish as his body was consumed by flame from the inside out. But the sorceress's sadness, her misery, her empathetic suffering was soon joined by another emotion: anger. rage, fury, hate for the murderous, cruel oaf that sat nearby, chewing gleefully on crusts of bread as he watched the monk, watched as close as he had to a friend in the sundered worlds, watched the man he had already condemned to so much pain and torment. Maul, that self-proclaimed king, sat and watched, chuckling, while Xylan endured torture beyond imagination. Eventually, the brute had grown bored, had grown disinterested. He had his fill of cruelty, and he tired of watching Caleria work, of watching Xylan suffer. And perhaps more importantly, he simply tired. So Maul stretched himself out upon the rock, rolled away, turning his back to Xylan and the scorching light that shone through his pale skin, and the savage, the brute, the self-proclaimed king went to sleep, lulled into slumber by the monk's pitiful and pitiable whimpers. But eventually, those whimpers had faded. Xylan's agony had subsided, and Caleria joined him in deep, dreamless, exhausted sleep. The cave, that massive, vaulted cave, was silent until Maul was dragged from his dark, violent dreams by the sound of leathery wings beating the air. Xylan, though healed, was still too weak to be roused by such a gentle noise, and Caleria was too tired to give up the hold she had on sleep. Maul, with his ingrained, savage senses, with his brutish reflexes, heard the noise all too clearly. His eyes shot open, and he pushed himself up upon his hands and knees, muscles tensed like an animal, ready to strike. His mind was clouded from the suddenness of his waking, from being ripped from slumber so soon after drifting off, and most of all, from the toll that sleep always took on his shattered psyche, the mind that was as broken as the tundra that covered that dismal world. So he struggled to make sense of what he heard, struggled to scan that cavernous chamber, to seek out the source of the noise, of the leathery wings that forced their way through the still, fetid air. He looked first to the cave's opening, to that yawning arch, that massive entranceway that led back out to the tundra. And he saw nothing. He looked up at the craggy, vaulted ceiling, dotted with stalactites, slowly shedding liquid of unknown origins. And he saw nothing. But then, finally, he looked back, looked deep into the cave, looked to the pitch-dark pit at the back of that abandoned cavern, looked to the ominous shaft that they had inspected upon first coming into the cave, the one with sides too sheer, with bottom too deep to risk venturing down into. He looked back at that black hole, echoing with the growing sound of leathery wings beating the air. He saw terror. Rising up out of that pit was a monstrous apparition, an unnatural abomination, the body of a man, but massive, heavy, thick, covered in hair, with gargantuan hands on both its arms and its legs, powerful digits tipped with heavy, black, frightful talons, and the creature, the entire blasphemous beast, was held aloft by leathery wings that beat the air as it rose up toward the roof of the cave. Maul was shocked. He was horrified. He was disgusted. But his mind was stunted, crippled by agony, by suffering, by grief, by guilt, and most of all, by the excruciating lifetime he had spent in that roiling underneath. So though he wanted to yell, to let out a riotous battle cry, though he wanted to clamber to his feet and launch himself at the beast, though he wanted more than anything to take up his cudgel, that rough, wooden, notched, blackened, and bloodied club, to take it up and begin swinging it through the air, he was transfixed, a hostage of his own shattered mind. And Maul, that proud savage, could only watch in terror, struggling with the simple loop that held his weapon as the monster swooped down, colliding with him and sinking its talons deep within his shoulders. But though Maul's mind had been clouded, though it had been besieged by ghosts and spectral memories, the pain put an end to that. As the monster's claws pierced his skin, as they sunk into the heavy muscles that flanked his neck, the pain sent a strong wind blowing through Maul's mind, a gust powerful enough to blow away the clouds, to disperse those ghostly hindrances and free Maul from his psychic bondage. But though Maul's self came roaring back to him, though it filled his limbs with equal parts vigor and hate, it was far too little, far too late, and the king, the one true king of men, could only watch in horror as he dropped his club, could only watch the blood-stained cudgel clatter to the floor, which fell from him at a terrifying speed. Maul was lifted, carried, abducted by the monster, dragged into the upper reaches of that massive cave. Though he struggled, though he fought, though he used every ounce of his rage-fueled strength to free himself, it was for naught. The beast was too strong and too massive. It was a winged giant, so large that not even Maul's long, powerful arms could reach high enough to harm it, though he willed, though he begged, though he commanded them to stretch so that he might dig out the beast's massive yellow eyes. And as he did so, he shouted, yelled. He let loose a string of curses so foul, so cruel, so hateful and bitter that they burned his lips as he spat them out into the damp, fetid air of the cave. His obscene screams echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the stalactites that fell ever closer toward him and ricocheting down to the ears of his sleeping companions. She had slept through the beating of those leathery wings, had slept through the rush of air that accompanied the creature's attack on Maul. Not even Calaria's exhaustion was enough to allow her to sleep through the battle cry of the one true king of men. So Calaria woke. Lying next to the still unconscious Xylan, she opened her eyes to find a terrifying sight. Maul, that unbelievably powerful savage, as strong as he was odious, had been, shockingly, overpowered. And even more shocking was what assailed him. A creature she had thought to exist only in myth, to inhabit only the dreams, no, the nightmares of the supremely unlucky, a beast that even simple drawings of which sent shivers down her spine. Maul had been taken by a Grollock. Though Maul cried for help, though he commanded the sorceress to do something, commanded that useless, feckless witch to do anything, it was no use. She was petrified, held in place by the terror that had paralyzed Maul mere seconds before. The terror that had led to this, to Maul being hoisted into the air, perilously high above the rocky ground, held by a creature with only the worst intentions. He knew he was too high. He knew that the fall would be dangerous, perhaps even fatal. What choice did he have? What choice did he ever have? Would a king, would the one true king of men simply allow this monster to carry him off and have his way with him? No. He would not. He would not allow it. And instead, he would do what he always did. Maul would do what he must. So with rage boiling up within him, Maul reached up with both hands. He grasped the Grollock's thick, powerful talons, and in a fit of exertion, he bent them backward, listening to those ancient bones crack and splinter as he tore them from his shoulders. And then, every waking soul in that cave, the sorceress, Maul, even the Grollock itself, watched in amazement as Maul plummeted toward the ground. She was bound, hand tied to hand and foot tied to foot. But in spite of her bondage, she smiled. She smiled because she was lost in her own head, because she had given over to the world of dreams, of myth, and of fiction, because she had forsaken the world around her, forsaken that which was real. She smiled because she was lost in her mind and could not see who came through the door. He was flanked by the proctors, those kind, sweet, sadly smiling proctors, the ones who had given so much, who had worked so hard, so diligently to bring him back to the real world, to save him. They had helped him to learn what was real, what was important, what was really important. They helped him let go of his dreams, let go of the bondage those dreams held him in, helped him free himself from those mercurial, ephemeral hopes, and helped him tether himself to the ground. It was because of them he'd become who he was meant to be, the finest, best version of himself. They had sacrificed. They had struggled. They had fought so that he could turn away from that false liberty and enjoy true freedom, the freedom that came from willing confinement. Because when you were given absolute freedom, unregimented, undefined, what you were really given is a prison created by paralyzing choices, by unending possibilities, by a flood of what might be that distracts you from what actually is. He knew this now. It had taken him a long time, taken him far too long. He had spent far too much of his life fighting, struggling unnecessarily, when all he really needed to do was give in, accept the truth, accept the real world, and get to work. Finally, he had done just that. He'd gone to work. He had worked so well, worked so hard. He had been a good boy. He had sat down in the courtyard and set to building, set to putting mortar upon stone, stone upon mortar, and mortar upon stone, over and over again. He'd built the wall, day in and day out. And if he felt a temptation, when he felt the temptation to return to that world of dreams, he turned to that divine salve of the mind, to the anchor. He breathed it in, and once again, he went back to work. He was a good boy. He'd learned. It had taken him years, but he had learned. And now it was his time to give back. Just as the Proctors had struggled and sacrificed, just as they had committed themselves to him with unwavering dedication and determination, it was now his turn to do the same. It was his turn to bring her back, to free her from that crippling freedom, to tether her to the real world, to what matters, to teach her to be a good girl. So he pulled a chair in close. He lowered his prodigious bulk, lowered his flabby frame down upon that piece of simple wooden furniture. He smiled sadly as he brushed the hair back from her face. And then he set his jaw. He steeled his nerves. And he tied the strip of black cloth tightly over his eyes. Maul landed hard. Landed so hard that he felt the pain spider through his joints, felt it shake his muscles, wrap around his spine, and radiate out through his entire body. He was furious, but the pain was so intense. From the gaping wounds in his shoulders, gushing blood, from the paralyzing, twitching agony that enveloped his entire body, and most of all, from his severely wounded pride. The pain was so intense that though he wanted to scream, wanted more than anything to let out another string of those scathing, caustic curses, all that came out was a gasp. The fall should have been fatal, would have been fatal if it had been any other man. But this was not just any man. This was Maul. This was the one true king of men. He who carried the blood of kings, of conquerors, of murderers, madmen, and saints in his veins. And whether through luck, through the grace of the gods, or the blessings of someone else, though Maul landed with a crash that shook the very ground, sending wild vibrations through the rocks themselves, through every ounce of wind had been knocked out of his lungs, his eyes still held consciousness, awareness, and something even more crucial for one such as Maul. Rage. He was injured. Though his body was racked with pain, Maul had no time to waste, because even as he lay upon the floor gasping, the monster, the Grollock, began circling and letting out a howl made all the more terrifying by how human it sounded. Maul had broken the fingers that dug into his shoulders, but those were far from the Grollock's only weapons. The beast had another set of hands, tipped with vicious talons, and teeth that seemed too large to fit even inside that monster's gaping, cavernous mouth. The talons, the teeth, they were all bared and gleaming as the creature arched through the air and began to make its descent. Witch! Maul groaned, finding air somewhere deep within those spasming lungs. Do something! Your magics! Caleria, shaken into awareness as Maul's falling body had shaken the earth, picked up her water skin, her remaining water skin, containing all that they had left of that sacred solution. But this is the last. What if? Maul pushed himself to his feet, his voice joining his body as they both screamed in agony. I don't care! Do it! Now! But Calaria's magics, as potent as they were not some spear to be flung at a moment's notice. They were not even an arrow to knock and let fly after a momentary pause. No, the sorceress's magics required something very precious, something they had very little of. Time. Calaria began to center herself, began to reach out and summon forth the holy flame, that cathartic blaze, but the Grollock had no interest in waiting. The Grollock knew nothing of sportsmanship or a fair fight. The Grollock, one of the last of its kind, bereft of its mate, knew only one thing: survival. And it knew it exceedingly well. The monster, howling, no longer using stealth as a weapon, rocketed down toward Maul, toward its already wounded prey. But though Maul was injured, he was no longer asleep. He was awake, and so was his fury. Before the Grollock could even prepare to snatch the savage up, Maul did the unthinkable. Did something the Grollock had never experienced in all his years in the tundra. Maul, that brutal, violent king, leapt forward, sprang upward upon limbs that boasted a terrible, inexhaustible power, and he dug his fingers into the Grollock. Maul did his best to rip at the beast's flesh, but it was no use. The Grollock's hide was hard and weathered, impossible to tear even with instruments as powerful as Maul's calloused hands. But though Maul's attack wasn't as effective as he would have wished, his last-ditch effort, his frantic assault, was far from fruitless, as his momentum was enough to knock the monster off its course and send both of them crashing to the ground below. Maul struggled to scramble on top of the monster, to mount its back. He knew that he wasn't strong enough to overpower the beast. Even before his fall, he was nowhere near strong enough to compete with a giant. But if he could get to its back, if he could get to its head, if he could gouge its eyes, if he could feel those yellow globes burst on his fingertips, if he could grind his fingers down into whatever lay beyond those hate-filled eyes, he might just have a chance. Though Maul fought hard, fought ferociously, fought like the doomed animal he had become, it was no use. The Grollock was stronger, was faster, and it seemed to laugh as it squashed Maul's every attempt to gain the upper hand, his every attempt to bargain for leverage. And eventually, inevitably, the monster forced Maul to the ground, placed a massive hand on his throat, and began to squeeze slowly, steadily. Maul's eyes bulged out of his skull. Panic, fear, with rage, and with hate. He stared unblinkingly at the monster, committing its face to memory, promising himself that if he were to go to that inky black void of nothingness, if he were to finally, after all these years of suffering, if it were to finally take him, he would go remembering, never forgetting the face of the beast that bested him. Inky blackness began to swallow up his peripheral vision, and his ears filled with a roar. The roar of rushing blood inside his head, the roar of the waves assailing the ragged shores of his broken mind, the roar of the Grollock itself, and the roar of hungry flames. The creature lifted its hand suddenly, frantically, and Maul gasped, his bruised windpipe rattling as air rushed down to fill his lungs. As Maul regained his vision, as he fought off the encroaching darkness, he looked up and saw the Grollock, that massive, unbeatable monster, saw that filthy, primeval terror devoured by cleansing fire. The witch. She'd succeeded. She had done as he asked, as he commanded. Of course she had. He was a king, and even one such as she knew it. Climbing to his feet, Maul glanced back at her, at the panting, exhausted, terrified witch. He nodded his approval as the blood flowed from his shoulders, pooling between the broken stones at his feet. As the monster writhed on the ground, trying and failing to put out those inextinguishable flames, Maul staggered across the cave and stooped down, picking up that notched and worn, burnt and bloody length of wood. His cudgel. Though his body cried out for succor, for relief, Maul paid it no mind. He ignored it, urged forward by hate and hate alone. His knees gave out, suddenly weakened as the adrenaline left his body. Maul did not give up. He crawled. He dragged himself across the smooth, bloody stone floor of the cave, pulling himself up next to that whimpering, dying horror. The Grollock. And as the Grollock howled, in pain, in shock, in fear of that encroaching, inky black void of nothingness, Maul smiled. A gruesome smile, a rictus grin, with blood seeping out between his teeth. He raised that grisly cudgel, and he whispered, softly, "Your death mattered, beast. You died by my hand." I hope you're enjoying listening to SKALD as much as I am enjoying creating it for you each and every week. The thing is, as a completely independent, unaffiliated, DIY production made available for free with absolutely no advertising, it's tough to justify not only the raw costs like hosting fees, but also the opportunity costs associated with all the time required to produce 4 new episodes each and every month. That is why the SKALD Patreon campaign is so important. Patreon allows you to contribute small monthly dollar amounts to the things you love. Things like SKALD. It cuts out middlemen like advertisers or podcasting networks, and it truly makes you not just a fan, but a patron. Fitting for a series that's a modern take on bardic tradition. A bunch of folks have already taken the plunge and signed up at patreon.com/SKALD, including Cody, aka Enigmatic Pariah on Twitter. Go find him and tell him thank you for helping to keep this show going and growing. Also, make sure to check out his podcast, The Orccast, spelled DORCCAST. It's a nerd and geek-themed discussion amongst his gaming group, the Dapper Orcs. If you want to shout out like Cody, head on over to patreon.com/SKALD and sign up today. Once you've done all that, come find me on social media. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Or hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my upcoming Street Fighter G.I. Joe comic book, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. This week's recommendation is another music one. As soon as this is done, go immediately to check out Leafhound. Put Leafhound on while you do all the other stuff that I asked you to do earlier. I'd never heard of them until Spotify recommended them to me, and I am super happy that they did. They're a 70s proto-stoner doom rock band that sound like the groovier parts of Led Zeppelin, but with a Rod Stewart-esque lead singer. It's perfect. Listen to Growers of Mushroom, the album or the song. Listen to both. You'll love them. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.